Hey, good evening, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And hooray, we get our trio back with David Cranmer, Underdown, and Mark Kulacz. And I want to have a round of applause just for you guys. Welcome back. All right. I think it's been about a month or so since we did one of these trios, and I appreciate both of you so much. Seems like I don't know, maybe a year or so we've been doing Wednesday nights together, and I'm just delighted. I learned so much from you. So thanks for being with me tonight. And we're in the middle of a whole lot of whitewater right now. We're learning stuff fast. We're discovering things fast. Things are happening fast. And, so let's, let's share what's going on. What's going on with you this week, David Cranmer, Underdown?
Well, I've been just continuing to try to learn as much background information as I can, and I enjoyed watching the shows that you've done with Harley. I thought was a great show on Monday, I believe, and then Mark had a great show on was it Sunday night that you did the Margaret Hamburg show?
Yes, it was Sunday. It wasn't really expected to be that much Hamburg, but it just wound up that way. As you know, sometimes you get to a point where you're like, why aren't people getting it?
Well, I didn't see that one, so maybe we could start, Mark, if you would give us a summary.
This is Dave kicking it off. Dave has a bunch of stuff to kick off with. But
well, I was gonna, like I've said, I learned so much from watching your shows, and of course with the history of Margaret Hamburg and her family. I'm somebody that always likes to know the background of where people grew up and what their families are like. And of course, her father has this rich history with the Carnegie Foundation, with Joshua Lederberg, who's somebody that Mark has done a lot of shows on.
Actually, if I may interrupt, just start off by just reviewing, if someone's just watching the show, why is David Underdown talking about the Hamburglar? Who's this Margaret Hamburg? Please.
I think that everybody, there's so much to read into the Milken Foundation having a seminar. Again, Peggy Hamburg is just one of the world leading experts in tabletop terrorism and disease surveillance and pandemic response experts in the world. And she is featured with Tony Fauci, who we all know was one of the leaders of the response to the coronavirus. And our other favorite is Mr. Rick Bright on the BARDA, who, again, like there are all these sidebars that go with it. Like Rick Bright gets into these fights with Robert Kadlec. And Robert Kadlec, of course, being from Michigan, I'm very interested in how Emergent Biosolutions ends up in Lansing, Michigan, with a German-Iranian CEO, Froud Al-Hibri.
Mm-hmm.
And how they they come from Bioport and their joint venture with Port and Down. And, I know you're very interested in the history of all of these different, Port and Down's role in biological and chemical warfare and the American seemingly partnerships historically with them. So they're in this meeting, and I think is it in November of 2019? I don't even know the exact date, but but Rick Bright makes the famous quote that we need an entity of excitement to get away from the egg-based vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have really dove right into so deep is what is the alternative? What are we talking about to these egg-based, quote unquote, traditional methods for producing vaccinations? And so
October 29th, 2019, by the way, was the Universal Flu Milken Institute, New York City, I believe, event that you're referring to.
Right. And again, like for me, like my background's finance, and this is what we were sort of saying offline before the show, is I'm always interested in the financial impact of these things. And you know, the pharmaceutical companies are interesting, but the hedge funds that sort of promote these issues are also really interesting to me. And of course, Michael Milken is very famous for being the junk bond king of the 80s with Drexel, Burnham, and Lambert, which has a very interesting, rich history also, which ties right into our Cham Weitzman commercial solvents corporation, because the initial Burnham in Drexel, Burnham, and Lambert was in fact Schenley, what became Schenley Liquors. So there were four main during Prohibition, and we sort of talked about this a little bit last time, but there were four major players, and it was the Brofmans had Seagrams. Everybody knows Seagrams. And then there was Hiram Walker, which was in Detroit. And then there was United Distillers and Schenley's. And those were considered the big four of the American liquor. So Drexel, Burnham, Lambert, the Drexel in Drexel, Burnham, Lambert is a longtime partner going back to 1904, I believe, with J.P. Morgan. It was Morgan and Drexel. So you have all these kind of old partnerships, and they had merged in the 40s with, you know, Brown Brothers, Harriman, and all this stuff. So Drexel, Burnham, Lambert has this like very historical impact in our financial system. And then, of course, we get to the scandals of the 80s and the junk bonds. And, you know, Michael Milken is this, you know, high-flying financier that everybody, you know, is fascinated with. He's, I think, the highest paid guy on Wall Street and everything, and has this spectacular crash. And he, you know, then gets into philanthropy. You know, he gets into this Milken Institute with George Washington University, which we had, you know, talked about before too, where a lot of, you know, the Dulles brothers, you know, Alan Dulles went to law school there. Bill Barr is a law school alumni. You know, we've talked about all these things. So it just seems like this very interesting grouping of people coming together to have this this summit to talk about getting away from traditional egg-based vaccines. So when we talk about Margaret Hamburg, that's why it's so interesting, because, you know, this is just one of many instances. You know, even more recently, you talked about the monkeypox, and with the Munich Security Conference and the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which he's a big part of.
Director of biological warfare preparation or something of that nature. Yes.
Yeah. And of course that, and to review that for people who don't remember Nuclear Threat Initiative, it's fascinating because it was founded by Sam Nunn, who is one of our founders of the Nunn-Lugar that becomes DTRA. It's George Pratt Schultz, who we've talked about being the Loomis High School rival of John's dad. And it is William Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense. And the last, Henry Kissinger, of course. We have to talk about Henry. He was one of the four founders. And then Ted Turner is the fifth person. And of course, it also ties in with the whole nuclear fuel bank with Warren Buffett in Kazakhstan. That was all under the umbrella of Nuclear Threat Initiative. So there's a lot of intrigue there. And it just seems like Peggy is somebody that's, you know, just right in the mix with all of these DTRA, Nunn-Lugar. You talked about the FDA that she had a huge role in the 90s and all this stuff. So again, it's just a character that, as you said in the very beginning, why are we talking about Peggy Hamburg? And I feel like it's like, well, why are people not talking about Peggy? She seems to be in the middle of all these really big issues that are affecting us right now at this very minute.
Yeah, well said. So this event and the video is still available on C-SPAN. I have downloaded copies. I'm surprised C-SPAN hasn't removed this video yet. It's a 1-hour video of at the Milken Institute. We have Rick Bright there, who at that time was the director of BARDA, which is the Biomedical Advanced Research Development Agency, I think. I'm like 2% wrong on that. Anthony Fauci, director of the NIAID. We have Margaret Hamburg, who is at that time, I believe, was a director at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is a non-government organization, international non-government organization. They deal with concerns related to all types of weapons of mass destruction, which includes chemical, includes biological, and there's probably some other classifications which we are just not aware of yet. There's one other woman there who is a director of. I apologize. I only researched her roles a little bit. Now, this event was popular to some, anyways, who are doing the research. Not known at all to people who only watch C-SPAN or Fox, or CNN or Fox, because Rick Bright in this event said, as Dave just said, we need a what's the word? Something of excitement, an event of excitement, or an entity of excitement, to help advance the manufacture and development of vaccines to a new era, to get flu vaccines away from egg-based. Usually they've been growing, developing, and manufacturing vaccines for 80 years plus using eggs of chickens were quite popular. And there's probably a few other ways, but they want to make it so that they can make them faster, perhaps a higher quality, less contaminants, etc. But there's going to be a big risk in that transition. It may take some time. And how do you get people to sign up for that? Those are big questions. So, as Rick Bright was saying, you need something that would compel people to want to take the risk, such as a pandemic with a novel pathogen in it, something which has never been seen before, something where you can hold the media captive and use the media to hold everyone else captive, lockdowns, scare tactics, and then ultimately mandatory stuff, right? And there's obviously focus on this meeting on what he said, and rightfully so, and a few comments that Anthony Fauci made. But there's 3 other people on the board, aside from the person who's doing the interviewing there. They're not just, they weren't people who were just, passing through. These are 3 extremely historically significant people. And even I haven't even reviewed all of them in detail, but Margaret Hamburg is there, who's a name that until coronavirus started, I never heard of her name. Perhaps I'm guilty for being disconnected with the news for this. However, you mentioned she was involved with the FDA. She was the director of the FDA for 7 years. One of the longest running FDA directors for 7 out of the 8 years of the Obama administration. So that's kind of a big deal. And so, but I apologize. I was just doing my own thing in life. I guess I didn't notice. So she's there. Okay. And a previous FDA director is there. Why are we continuing to talk about this? Well, as Dave had mentioned, she had become a director within the Nuclear Threat Initiative, this non-government, there she is, organization. And in 2021, she, as an expert in tabletop exercises, had done a tabletop exercise of a monkeypox outbreak. I don't know why that was on their list, but okay. And sure enough, there was a monkeypox outbreak, at least so we're led to believe. Who knows what it was? And it just happened to be in 2022 on the exact, like almost to the day, they suggested in the tabletop scenario. And of course, you think, come on, they can't. Come on, give us a break. You can't be that stupid. Change the date or something. All right. Again, why are we continuing to talk about Margaret Hamburg? Well, Margaret Hamburg also was involved in tabletop exercises for bioterrorism events in 1999 and 2000. She was the health coordinator, the lead health coordinator director of New York City, worked with Rudy Giuliani and was involved in those exercises for what they call it, the Dark Winter exercises, with several other people. She was in Congress in the middle of August of 2001, talking about the possibilities of a major terrorist bioterrorism event, major U.S. metropolitan center, probably New York City, and an anthrax or smallpox attack. Only 3 weeks before September 11th, actually 2.5 before September 11th in 2001. Okay, so she's been around for a while. Now, Dave also just mentioned that this nuclear threat initiative, of which she was a director, one of the directors of, was founded based upon concern of, or motivated by concerns of, weapons of mass destruction. And weapons of mass destruction is something that the United States, former U.S. Senators Sam Nunn of Georgia and Richard Lugar, famously known as Dick Lugar of Indiana, were the leaders of, hence the Nunn or Nunn-Lugar program. And they started in the 1990s, maybe the late 1980s, but 1990s, and they worked with the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, to collect and decommission large quantities of their nuclear weapons, their weapons of mass destruction, to collect, to decommission, disable, reprocess, etc. And eventually that turned into addressing chemical weapons and biological weapons in what is the former Soviet Union over the next several years. Nunn and Senators Nunn and Dick Lugar, I have to say it, were motivated or inspired to work with the former Soviet Union to decommission their nuclear weapons by a great American patriot, and that is Dr. David Hamburg. David Hamburg was, from I think 1979, 1980 to 1992, the director of the Carnegie Corporation. He was on a first name basis with the Russian leadership, helping them initiate the process of removing their nuclear weapons, which eventually they took them apart and they reprocessed the enriched uranium. Was at the gigawatts, megawatts. Thank you. And he just so also happens to be the father of Margaret Hamburg. So the daughter of the person who ended the nuclear threat of planet Earth is sitting 2 people over from Bright, and it just gets a pass. And she's been wrapped up in almost everything related to biological warfare, tabletop exercises, and during those years, that 7-year tenure as the FDA director under the Obama administration, extensive work was done to advance legislation, to refine legislation that would enable the Food and Drug Administration to provide emergency use authorization, or EUAs, to brand new medicine under the condition that there was a dangerous, deadly, never before seen pathogen, something which, because it's so new, nothing is going to work for it. Of course, they need to find ways to be sure nothing that sits on the shelf is going to work for it. They need to find it early enough, and then they need to have a way to be able to express approve all of these new medicines which coincidentally would perfectly satisfy the condition which Rick Bright said we needed to be excited to meet. And that is, what will happen? What can cause us to move past this ancient way of using eggs to make vaccines? Well, gene therapy, being able to print and use bacteria to, instead of having to make all the material, we can actually maybe even create a platform, use mRNA or DNA, and just inject the instructions in there and use people's bodies to make their own proteins, which we then can make antibodies to, etc. So it just all comes together, and just by having and not taking the time to analyze things beyond just a couple of really sharp, delicious quotes, you can just see how so many things in history for decades just all start to come together. And I'm not suggesting that Margaret Hamburg's the brainchild of this, nor am I saying she isn't. it just helps. It just helps to be able to put so many things in history together, and to understand the significance of that meeting. And yes, decades of concerns of nuclear weapons and atomic energy all do absolutely tie into what is happening right now, the state of emergency, the new medicines, the clearances involved, etc. It's all very much connected.
I wonder about the true extent of the Manhattan Project. We speak of it in terms of creating a nuclear bomb, and that's as far as we go. But considering the personalities involved and the secret budgets and everything else, and when you think about who somebody like James B. Conant, who was the president of Harvard during the war and during my father's time as a Harvard student, but was the man who first during World War I set up the American University as a testing ground for gas weapons, for shells, and we're still digging them up around American University today. Poison gas, mustard gas, and that stuff. That was his creation and his baby. And then we go to World War II and we find there he is making anthrax bombs. This is the same. He's on the Manhattan Project. He's going to the Bohemian Grove. And all of this, stuff has to do with one thing and one thing only, and that is killing a whole lot of people, with one way or another. Does that make sense to you guys?
Dave?
It sadly it does, and I think that we look at the National Defense Research Committee, and Conant was one of the directors of it, and you throw in the Vannevar Bushes and the Carl Comptons, who was the head of MIT right next door to Harvard, and all these are the people that were really called to action. Once, we've talked a lot about this Einstein and Slizard letter that, inspires FDR to take the action to create this Manhattan Project with these, secret weapons and secret research groups to develop them. And, it's really important to know where that stuff comes from, because as we've, as we get into like what's happening now, you can draw direct lines to it. I mean, Mark was talking about the Richard Lugar, Dick Lugar, he prefers, obviously.
Have a chuckle. Come on, you need to lighten the mood every once in a while.
I feel like I'm part Indiana. My mom always told me I was part Hoosier growing up. So I am always trying to find the good parts of Indiana, because there's a lot of really bad parts. And, Richard Lugar was the mentor to this Mitch Daniels, who's the current president at Purdue. And he, was a director at Eli Lilly. He was the director of the Hudson Institute. And, you get into all these old Rand corporations and Hudson Institute. I mean, those were started by Herman Kahn. He was one of the founders. And these are the guys that are doing the wargaming for nuclear weapons. And, why they took Hudson from Hudson and Hastings or whatever, right on, right in New York and Westchester, and move it to Indianapolis and partner with Eli Lilly. I don't know all the background of that stuff, but, we've talked a lot about Alex Azar and his role. And, he was right there with the NIH for years, but he also had a directorship with Eli Lilly before that. And so you've got Mitch Daniels with Lilly, you've got Azar, you've got half the founder of the Nunn Lugar is right there as the mentor. So,
and who did Lugar mentor? One of the most important people that he took on his first road trip. Please. Well,
the famous Barack Obama, of course, was.
I've heard of him.
He was taken, but there's the other one, is the husband of Eric Braverman. And if people remember the whole "Where is Eric Braverman" story, who was the director of the Clinton Global Initiative, his husband is a man named Neil Brown that is a director of KKNR with our favorite David Petraeus. So you've got these Lugar, he was called the favorite mayor of, America's favorite mayor. He's the mayor of Indianapolis, and, becomes the senator and all this stuff. But yeah, it's, I hate it because, as I've said, like my grandparents, their relatives fought with Colonel Eli Lilly in the Civil War. So it goes back to the 19th century. And my grandma's best friend was the librarian for the Lilly Library in Bloomington, that you've pulled all this stuff on Herman Muller, and who was a really important character. I mean, we talk about like Lederberg and all these guys, but I think Muller's right in there with Einstein, with Slazard. I mean, he's a name that's in the grouping. I mean, maybe not the top of the list, but he's right in the grouping with them.
Oh, it's huge, and that was your encouragement, I must admit. I mean, I knew that he was an important figure historically, but you kept nudging me, and sure enough, yes, he's
the other one that I just am getting into now is the Pugwash conferences, and the Pugwash conferences were a sort of the initial think tank to do non-nuclear proliferation, and the guy that started them was his last name was Eaton. His dad was the minister of John D. Rockefeller in Cleveland, and he was the head of Republic Steel, and he was the one that sort of financed these initial Pugwash conferences. But they were an international, sort of like the 50 years before the Nunn-Lugar. This was sort of the idea, was these Pugwash conferences. So again, you just think of hogwash, the old saying, but it's Pugwash, and that's like a place, I think, in Nova Scotia where they hosted the conferences.
Building on what I'll take a stab at John's question now. It's still not clear how confident the leading scientists were who signed the letter in 1938, which went to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, to encourage him to invest in these atomic weapon projects. I suspect that at least several were confident that there was going to be a chance of that working. And I know I have a non-popular view on the success of that part of the project. Okay. But that said, where the way to answer the question, the answer to the question is really, well, what else happened in there? And I think that's where you're going with this, John. And the way the narrative has been, how are people harmed, hypothetically, by a atomic blast? Of course, there's tremendous heat. There's a massive movement of wind. There's collapse of infrastructure. And then there is radiation. Radiation can cause burns, and it can cause cancers. And that plays on a school of thought which started a couple of decades before that, where Hermann Muller actually was studying the impacts of radiation, and can radiation, made available by the ownership of radium, can that cause genetic mutations? So there was a association of the study of radiation and genetics going back to well before World War II. So embedded within the Manhattan Project was a lot of research on cancer, a lot of research on how radiation can cause cancer, maybe even cure cancer in some cases. How much of it? I'm not saying it was half, but it was a pretty big part. And there were several scientists, such as Hermann Muller, who was recruited into studying that aspect of radiation exposure for the Manhattan Project. There was also a division within what became the Manhattan Project after World War II, the Atomic Energy Commission, where several leading scientists in cancer research worked for a while and then sort of moved back and forth between there and medical research in such as the first cancer hospital in the United States, Memorial Sloan Kettering in Manhattan. By the way, the funding for Memorial Sloan Kettering, I forget the names of the first names of Sloan and Kettering. I know that you would know, David.
Charles and Alfred.
Excellent. Thank you. There's a couple of Sloans, so it's confusing. The funding for that, the first cancer hospital, came 24 hours after Hiroshima. So, I mean, I don't know how else to say how closely all the events of the Manhattan Project are and the destructions in Japan and cancer research in the United States. And at Memorial Sloan Kettering were some of the most impactful people with respect to vaccine research, cancer research in U.S. history, including Dr. Cornelius P. Rhodes, including Chester Southam, including Dr. Alice E. Moore, and many, many others. There's so much came out of that hospital. Quite a few of those people wound up in the virus cancer research program. I had a guest on last night, citizen researcher Nick of the World, helping us out with that, reviewing some of Dr. Leonard Horowitz's work. And I suspect that in the process of trying to learn more about viruses, they bumped into a whole lot of interesting observations with respect to incompatibility between tissue and blood exchanges between animals and people, and started noticing slow cancers. And that is what, over time, turned into what we know as zoonosis, emerging viruses. It's been rebranded many different ways. So this compartment of the Manhattan Project was a big part of allowing to create and fester and fuel what we're dealing with now, which again emphasizes how important it is to note. You have the guy who worked with Russia to get rid of their nukes, and his daughter is running the FDA, making sure EUAs will be available to us. This stuff you cannot be separated. These are not, there's not like a couple of Kevin Bacons here in the middle. They are the same family. They're eating the same table. They're father and daughter. I don't know how else to say it with any more exclamation marks in that. So we're not trying to force discussions of nukes into the conversation. It is part of the conversation.
I think it's very significant, too, that what you pointed out about how Sloan Kettering, the first cancer-focused hospitals, pops up right after the Hiroshima, Nagasaki bombings. And one wonders what was more important to them. Was it really that important to them that they blew up Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the most horrible weapon they could come up with, or was it just to introduce us to the era of radiation, and radiation being everywhere? Because nowadays radiation seems to be everywhere, and there's an awful lot of sources of radiation, and we do know I'm quite certain of it from reading about the experiments, that they can change cells with radiation, and altering cells is creating cancer. Taking a cell and screwing it up in a way that it's going to multiply and take over the organs of the body that it does, to thousands and thousands of people all day long, every day. And they knew that. So the idea, radiation, I mean, what is radiation? Is listening to the radio? Are you getting radiation from the radio waves? Are you walking through a wave if you walk through your kitchen and there's a microwave on? You don't know. But we do know that the people are very, very worried about things like 5G and the whatever's coming next after that. A lot of people are very serious looking into it. So there is that. But
I think the key is sustained exposure. I mean, your body's designed to take injuries. Over the years, we've been subject to blasts of radiation from all different parts of the environment over short periods of time, and our bodies know how to repair. But that sustained, working next to a functioning microwave for 10 hours a day, there's almost no analogy to that on God's green earth. And so something like that could cause cancer. Holding the cell phone or the radar detector, right up to your eyeball, hours on end. Yes.
And but that doesn't stop us. We do it. We humans they figured out that, if they gave us these little bricks that we can hold in our hands and all kinds of toys on it, from video games to, you name it, we got addicted to it, and they knew we'd get addicted to it. So, it's their sinister program is working, but let me spend a little time, if you would, spend a little time with me on what to me is the most the most progress I've made in a long, long time on my father's case. And that is when, I talked to Nick from Twitter on my show on Friday night.
Great show.
Thank you. And I watched your great show with Nick. I think it was Monday night, perhaps. But
last night, yes. But
last night, okay. And, when I was on my show with him, I thought I heard him say that the hepatitis B vaccine research was, in fact, the good part was the tip of the iceberg was the vaccine research to try to cure, but that beneath that was a hidden part of the program in which they're trying to figure out how to give cancer to people. And I thought, oh, well, that's the first time I've ever heard that. I've been at sea on that question of hepatitis for a few years now, because the first people, close to experts that I ever asked about it said they hadn't distinguished hepatitis into classes of A and B and C by 1962, when my father got the hepatitis. But he says, no, they did, that there was hepatitis B trials going on in the 50s. Well, that was news to me. And then he said they were doing it at Willowbrook. Well, I knew about Willowbrook. We had done a show on Willowbrook about 2 months ago. But the idea that they had a hepatitis B program going on in the 50s, well, he said, you have to understand that they've changed the name. It used to be under something like AUAG or something, an Australian something. And there was another name they gave to it. So, it's a shell game. You don't know that they were studying it in the 50s, because the legend that they put out is that they didn't distinguish them until, 64, 65.
Correct.
Now, on the other hand, when he said the same thing on your show last night, and he's provided a huge bibliography, which I started to go through, but I find it, I don't know how to do research on the NIH or the NCBI or that stuff, and that's what has to be done next, is to find the connection. He did connect it to Alan Dulles. And, when you connect it to Alan Dulles, then you've got my dad's nemesis right there. So here's briefly, my dad is a high-level FBI agent working for J. Edgar Hoover. In 1961, he's been there for 10, 11 years. And some guys from the Pentagon come and recruit him and say, we want you to come and run our special operations planning division at the Pentagon, because President Kennedy is taking special ops away from the CIA and putting them back into the Pentagon. Well, he goes and talks to Hoover about it. Hoover gives him his blessing, and he says, okay, I accept. Boom, he gets hepatitis. Right then, March 1962, he starts at the Pentagon on April the 1st. Well, as much as I know is he ends up in the hospital for a couple of weeks. I'm not sure exactly how long, but I do remember when he came home, he was still bedridden for weeks, and he was just as yellow as could be from jaundice. But he recovered and had superb employee ratings at the Pentagon after he recovers. And I'm hearing, Ian, I'm sorry, Nick from Twitter. And thank you, Nick, so much for sharing your research with us. It's really a gold mine. But I'm thinking, this just about solves the case. Here he gets the hepatitis when he's transitioning to go to the Pentagon. Well, people like Wayne Madsen, George Webb, others have speculated as to, but they would say, well, they wanted to make him sick so they'd have time to go through his files, so that they got time to snatch what they wanted to before he moved into the Pentagon, so that, they had control over stuff, because he was going to be in charge of all the special ops for any military or civilian operation. So that's a pretty good theory. But when, on top of that, what Wayne Madsen said is that when somebody's going to be in a sensitive position, they want to impair them. They want to give them that health alteration committee treatment so that they're not as effective, so they're not as efficient, so they're having to go to the doctor, or they can't move around as much, or they're just not as thoughtful as they would have been. They might be compromised in some way. But then on top of that, he comes down with cancer, with the doctor, the death certificate, and his private doctor said it was metastasized cancer. It means that jumps from an organ to another organ. That's a sign that it was a weaponized strain, that it would jump like that and jump quickly and kill him so quickly. So my suspicion is that he became a guinea pig for them, that they said, we're going to give this guy hepatitis, and we're going to monitor him, and we're going to give him our trial vaccines. And, that was probably something that, if it happened, was administered to him during those long hours that he was during those last 3 or 4 years of his life. They would keep him at work, till 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And he'd come home completely exhausted. I mean, unable to talk to you. He couldn't help you with your homework. He just had to stare at the TV for a little while and then go crash and do it again the next day. It was, anyway, that's my experience. And, we need to dig into the medical literature to find, where was these Hep B vaccine trials, where were they going on, who was doing it. But if we can tie it into the intelligence community, this thing that I felt in my gut for decades now is going to get solved. And I think we're getting close. What do you guys, do you think I'm on the right track here?
Do you know if he was required to take any medicines, any therapies as part of his new employment?
I don't know. I do not know. I just know that he was absent from home a lot, and they could have done whatever they wanted to with him, while they had him. That is maybe will always be a mystery, is how they did it. But he bounces back from a nearly deadly case of hepatitis. They must have been giving him some medication of some kind.
The most effective way to be able to transmit that would be blood-to-blood transfusion somehow. Oral. Mm-hmm. It's, as Nick mentioned about the oral polio vaccines, some of those being contaminated. Most people didn't get any infections. Some people had some cancers, but it was mostly in the mouth area. The body is very capable of destroying bad stuff that goes into our digestive system. It's not a very effective way to be able to get that stuff. So it's this stuff, right? It's the with the little needle little trigger on it It's that stuff because it goes, blood to blood, another animal or host to the recipient. And there's not many cases where that can happen just naturally, other than usually it's a medical treatments. And the symptoms that you've described tonight and previously about your dad very much line up with what we would see with someone who had a bad squeezy thing, a bad juice thing. Now, was it administered intentionally though? I don't know. I don't see evidence one way or the other. I do believe that given at that time, 1961, I mean, they had already announced that there were known batches of cancer-causing samples taken from various primates. So that had already been known since probably the late 1940s. No, at least, maybe even before that. So could that have been used in 1961? Absolutely. With the precision of the 1970s, hard to say. The virus cancer program that we refer to pretty frequently got started in the mid 1960s. Not long after that, there are already international congresses being held, summits being held, talking about cancer-causing viruses. And usually that was in tandem with vaccine manufacturing. So that topic wasn't exactly a secret either. Some people I've researched, I can find their flight records over to some of the big conventions, not like little things. I mean, like whole conference centers over in Russia. They were having these cancer World Cancer Congresses is what they were calling them. We just need to find a specific instance. And again, oral administration, not so effective. Didn't really have the technology at the time for like just for putting it on one's skin without a cut or an abrasion. So that's something that if you could find those records would be illuminating.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, you guys were mentioning this Sabine vaccine, and that's what I got, and that was administered with sugar cubes. So we had to line up in the junior high school auditorium and go up and get our sugar cubes, and it was something my parents didn't really want to do, but in the end they said, well, everybody's doing it and you got to do it to go to school. And so we just did it. I think Dr. Mary's Monkey, the book, when I read that, and at the same time, not too long after that, I get diagnosed with prostate cancer, and it's a soft tissue cancer. It's just the kind of thing that Haslam was writing about in his book. So in my own case, there's that. But in my dad's case, I think what we have here is we have motive and we have opportunity. And, you say you don't see evidence of intent, but I think we can imply intent once we have the technical means in the hands of Alan Dulles or Richard Bissell, people who are being deprived of their special ops operations. I mean, this was a war between the Pentagon and the CIA. And the CIA was not happy having to give their files to Tom O'Loughlin. They didn't want to do it. So if they could get him out of the way, I think they had a perfect motive to do what they could do. And whether it was the hepatitis, an attempt to sicken him so bad he couldn't perform, or was it setting him up with the compromised immune system, which hepatitis is going to compromise your immune system as well, which makes, although, most people wouldn't get cancer from cancer cells that are ingested, the weaker your immune system gets, the more likely you are, I think, to be a victim of that. And then there's the whole issue of when he suddenly got a severely, I mean, terribly infected great toe, which is exactly how Bob Marley got cancer. when he was given by William Colby's son a pair of, some people say boots, some people say athletic shoes, but whatever it was, the story is that there was a little wire in there that was treated with some carcinogenic material, in which he got infected from that. And, that's what ultimately killed him at a very young age. So, they could have done that to him through his athletic shoes. He used to go to the Pentagon gym and play squash with people, or maybe it was handball. I can't remember what it was, but and there's a many. I mean, I could spin a story around it in no time at all. But I think the motive is there. I think the opportunity
absolutely
is there, and what I didn't have was the technology. But I think we've got the technology now.
Motive is there. Technology is there. Access to technology is there. Now it's just finding the vehicle, the vector.
Mm-hmm.
So you're absolutely right and justified. If I were you, I'd keep digging. Trying to find when that might have been. I'm sure it's out there somewhere. The evidence is out there somewhere.
Yeah, now that we know that there was Hep B and they were doing these vaccine trials, and now I need to just really dig into the material that's been shared at the bibliography by Nick. And boy, if anybody else wants to dig into that and try to find the hepatitis B vaccine trials in the early 50s,
under a different name, there was more.
It's called AU-AG or something like that.
Yeah, and the names of these things have changed over time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were injecting things into people. They were filtering it, and they didn't know what they were filtering out. They didn't know what was still in there. They were identifying things symptomatically. So sometimes different doctors would find the same thing. So the definitions of things have changed a lot over time. So you always have to factor in what was the state of technology at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Things has that been rebranded? Was what was known as Hep C at one time, in reality, several different contaminants identified at a later point in time? We don't know. So it's not like it's a clearly identified thing you can see under a microscope. It's like when West Nile virus was being tested on people in the 1949, literally, they couldn't see anything. It was just identifying it symptomatically. And then it went down in all the research papers as West Nile virus. It looks kind of technical, but that's hardly a clear genetic description of whatever it was in those samples, which were injected into people unknowingly. But that has to mate with something today, which it would be more precise. So especially this topic of viruses, you have to always factor in the era of the observation, who made the observation, and note that the definitions have changed a lot over time. They continue to change. David, what are your thoughts on John's father?
I wanted to add that one of the big takeaways that I got from Nick was that he talked about the groupings of scientists that came over in Paperclip, and how a lot of the people that were in these virology programs ended up at Merck. And again, like, we have to remember George Merck, who was the sort of founder of the biological weapons program under the same programs we were talking about, the National Defense Research Committee. They started Fort Detrick. They brought in Ira Baldwin, who we've talked about as an original Indiana boy that goes up to Wisconsin and becomes the head of their biology department. He has a student named Sidney Gottlieb at the University of Wisconsin, who's somebody that was the head of the disease alteration, or the health alteration committee. Another thing I didn't know is that Gottlieb had a brother that actually worked in the, I think, kind of the super soldier program, because all that Lance Armstrong blood doping stuff, that was his brother's project.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, Gottlieb had a brother, and I was actually just looking at this today. But the other thing that is important to remember with Merck and with George Merck is that it ties in a couple other old characters. One is Vannevar Bush becomes the head of Merck, the chairman of the board after George Merck passes away. So you also have, Vannevar Bush becomes the chairman. He's the chairman of Carnegie Corporation also, coming from MIT. I'm telling you, look at Vannevar. He was also the leader of Bohemian Grove, all that stuff. I mean, he's right in there. So,
by the way, you have to say Vannevar because it rhymes with Leave It to Beaver.
Well, Vannevar, I've never seen anybody with that spelling of that name before. But again, Vannevar, Leave It to Vannevar, is also the founder of Raytheon, guys. I mean, he's the founder.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and so I mean, you've got all of the Rad Lab, the MIT Rad Lab. You've got our Horace Roland Gaither, the guy I always like to talk about. He was the Rand Corporation founder. He was one of the, MIT Rad Lab guys. He had the first mutual fund with William Draper, who was, if you listen to Eustace Mullins, Draper says that Draper was actually the person that did was in charge of Japanese Reconstruction over Douglas MacArthur. He was Dillon Reed, experienced with Dillon Reed, and he sort of came in and did a lot of the refinancing, similar to what the Bank of International Settlements was doing with the Marshall Plan. So, and again, Horace Roland Gaither also starts MITRE Corporation, which is, Lincoln Lab and the whole Hanscom Air Force Base. And, they get very into the soldier vaccine programs as well. The other person that is a interesting Merck connection is this Zissner family. And I've talked to John about this offline, but there was a Frederick Zissner who had a Zissner Corporation in Hastings on Hudson in New York, and he was making the mustard gas for World War I. His daughters, he has two daughters. One of them marries John McCloy. The other one marries Louis Douglas. And again, I think secretly my grandma or great grandma is related to this Douglas branch. That's part of my theory. But with this Zissner, he has a brother that is he's a virologist, and he's a Columbia. He's somebody that's at the Fly Lab with Mueller and with Thomas Hunt Morgan. He also becomes a director at Merck Corporation and JP Morgan. Like, the guy does it all. So this Zissner family also has and again, I've seen it as another sister. Maybe it's a cousin, but Konrad Adenauer, who is another really key historical character in the reshaping of Europe post World War II, he marries a Zissner also. So when we talk about this Louis Douglas, he not only is working for Phelps Dodge, which is the largest mining corporation in the world, but his grandfather, William Douglas, is the one that donates the radium to Sloan Kettering originally, when it was the
it makes sense,
called Cancer Hospital, and he brings in this Ewing to be the head of And I know you're director. Memorial Sloan Kettering, and I feel like John D. Rockefeller Jr. sort of co-ops it, and they change the name, and they bring in the General Motors guys, said Charles Kettering and Alfred Sloan. But
it's like 1 block away from the Rockefeller Institute.
It's right, but originally, and again, like, these stories are crazy because the original story was called New York Cancer Hospital, and it was started as a memorial for U.S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was one of the first well-known people to die of cancer. He got mouth cancer from smoking cigars. And he had this whole turn of events, he went completely bankrupt at the end of his life. He had sold all of his assets. His son was, a big high flying Wall Street guy that lost all his money in a banking panic. And he died basically broke and died of cancer. And again, there was, I think, 5 families that donated to create this New York Cancer Hospital. And one of them was the Astor family. Another one was the Drexels, same Drexels from Drexel, Burnham, Lambert. Like, they're the big Philadelphia bankers that go way back, and they were partners with JP Morgan. So there is, as far as, the other thing that Nick talked about that I thought was very interesting was he separated MK Ultra and MK Naomi, and he made one of them was sort of the mind control or the truth serum, which was MK Ultra, but right. MK Naomi was more of the health alteration stuff, as far as permanent damage or whatever, slow cancers, things like that. So again, all these guys are in the group. I mean, we've talked about as John just alluded to, his dad has this role. The FBI is in charge. They're charged with doing the Q level clearance for all of these immigrants that are coming from post World War II. So John's dad is in a position where he's doing, he's reviewing these files as an FBI. That's his role. So you can see where there would be a real motive to influence this person that's doing these reviews, especially if he's in fact reviewing, people that are in national labs or the Merck's doctors that are, coming from, who knows, Kaiser Wilhelm or IG Farben or, IG Farben. Again, people have to remember that IG Farben is so much more than just, the death camps. I mean, they were one of the largest corporations in the world. They were involved in a huge amount of different areas in chemistry, not just pharmaceuticals, but it was part of it. So there's a lot in there. And of course, John McCloy, as we all know, was somebody that was really a key factor in dealing with the breakup of IG Farben after the war. And of course, he was the mentor. He was a director of Chase Manhattan Bank. He was the mentor of David Rockefeller. He was the director of Ford Foundation. So, like, all these things that we're talking about are related. And then the last one I wanted to say was when you were talking about the Sabin versus the Salk vaccine. The Salk vaccine had 5 companies that were allowed to manufacture it. And one of them was Eli Lilly that we talked about before. Another one was Park Davis, which I've talked about a lot personally because it was the Detroit pharmaceutical company. And again, my grandma, who had a similar fate to John's dad, was very close with the chief chemist of Park Davis Pharmaceutical, was her neighbor and friend. And the others were Wyeth, which people don't talk about Wyeth as much. Another one was called Pittman Moore, which was a more of a veterinarian vaccine program, but of course based in Indiana. And my friend, Mr. Dick Lugar's protege, Mitch Daniels, his father left Pennsylvania to move to Indiana to work for Pittman Moore. Mm-hmm. So Daniels has the Eli Lilly and the Pittman Moore, 2 out of the 5. And then, of course, the last one is Cutter Labs in Oakland, California, which, people really know about because there was the Cutter incident. And it led to the resignation of a woman named Olivia Culp Hobby. And she was the first director of the Health, Education, and Welfare Department. And she was married to Hobby, who was the mayor of Houston. They were in what was called the Suite 8F crowd, which was the quote unquote Texas oil men. She was one of the main people. I know we did a great show where we were talking about Roe versus Wade and Wade's history and sort of Dallas and Houston. Yeah. But there, we got to remember that Edwin Mandell House is a Houston background, and that his father was a railroad man and he was a blockade runner from Houston, Texas, and he was partners with Rice, that founds Rice University that we've talked about, with Mueller going to Rice University with Julian Huxley to start their biology program. Mark's talked about more recent Rice graduates. I forget those. There were two guys that you did a show on that were Rice University doctors. I can't remember, but
Marty Graham, William Gruber, who's the current president of vaccines at Pfizer.
Right, but the other person that's right in there with this House and with this Rice grouping is the Bakers, and James Baker. We all remember from, being the kind of the sidekick of George Pratt Schultz, but they also started a law firm in Houston, Texas called Baker Botts, and Baker Botts is it's right there with Sullivan and Cromwell as far as its international dealings. It was doing petroleum concessions all through Africa and the Middle East. It also has a lot of dealings with Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs. And this is James Baker, who, again, was right in there with the Iran-Contra. If you want to get into the side details, his next door neighbor was Joanne Herring, who we all remember from Charlie Wilson's War. But her husband was Richard Herring, who was the head of Houston Natural Gas, which merges with it merges to become Enron. So
what does it all mean? What does it all mean, David?
Honestly, it means that I don't know how I got skipped over on all this. I mean, I feel like my family is literally
have you?
What's that?
Have you?
The thing
we
is,
have to take your word that you have been skipped over.
Well, I don't feel like the thing is, I feel like I still have a chance, but I feel like I have not gotten a lot of help like over the course of my life. And I look at people like, what are we talking about now? We're talking about Elon Musk going on Twitter, proposing a peace agreement between Putin and Zelensky right now. And like, what's his background? Like, what's the PayPal mafia? Like, who was he dealing with In-Q-Tel as far as getting ICBMs from Russia in the same deal that we talked about before in the Nunn-Lugar? Like, how is he positioned there? I don't know. I mean, I feel like all these characters are, it's just, I don't know. I mean, it's hard. It's just hard for me because I mean, I feel like there's so much just like, I feel like we're in such a bad place right now with all this stuff, and I just don't feel like there's a way to stop it. And I wish so badly that what we're doing could have a real impact. I really wish it did, but I just don't. I don't know. I just don't feel like it will. I'm sadly.
Well, gentlemen, I think I'm going to try to wrap it up because we've gone over our hour, but I do appreciate everybody trying to wrap all of these, subjects into a package, let's put a bow on it and put it in a box and say, this is what it is. David's struggling to do that, to say, these are all the toys and they all go in this box, but what does that mean? How do we fix it? Is there any way out? And my theory has been that until we are honestly face the JFK assassination, as a country, that's a big key. And if you can't dig into that one, then at least dig into my father, because this is the story of my dad, and if we can solve what happened to my dad, we can solve what happened to the country. We can get back on track. We can restore, as you know, as we work with Harley Schlanger and other people. There are experts out there in economics and in science and in health that can help us to right the ship and get us back on track as a country. Don't despair. Jump into it. I've never spent any time on MK Naomi. Well, now I've got to do that. It's the next right thing for me to do, is to study MK Naomi and look through the bibliography that Nick has provided, and try to find, where's the virus experiment that would have been the one that was connected to the Health Alteration Committee that would tie it into my theory about what happened to my dad. I really think we're getting close on that. And so, don't despair. Keep going, everybody.
Don't despair. Remember, we're all going to be judged by what we do. It's not, don't judge your success on calling out all the bad people or all the mistakes of others. I know that's part of what we're doing here, trying to write history and capture it before it's lost. But the goal is, the winning is how we go about it. I know Dave, and I know you, John, maybe myself a little bit. Every once in a while, people enjoy listening to you. You give them a little bit of peace. It helps them understand the world a little bit more. And that's victory day to day. So don't despair. I understand. Trust me, I feel the way that you two, both of you guys, do from time to time, plenty of times actually. But you're both making a big difference. Proud to be working with you, both of you. So don't let it drag you down.
All right. Nope, not going to happen with me. I'm going to keep going, and I'm sure you guys as well, and everybody in the chat room. Hey, if you know anything about hepatitis B vaccine research in the 50s and 60s, please let me know. I'm at sea with this stuff, and but there's all kinds of leads that we haven't followed yet. So that's what I'll be up to. MK Naomi. I'm going to study it over the next few days. Thanks everybody for being with us. David, anything you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
No, I just want to say that I am grateful that my dog has been with me the whole time, and he's not barked and been a great companion. So I know my parents had a dinner tonight with their friends, so I was happy that he behaved.
All right, way to go, Bo. All right, Mark, anything else you'd like to add?
Get a good night's sleep.
All right, everybody. Thanks again. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Good night.